Hi everyone, this is Mr. Seymour, and this chapter, chapter 3, is going to talk about the issue of federalism. Your author calls it Federalism Forging a Nation. What this really is a discussion of the relationship between the national government and the states, and the fight for power and the sharing of power. So here's a discussion question to get us started. Should the government require all Americans to have health insurance? While individual Americans disagree about the question of Obamacare, the states and the federal government also disagree about the question of Obamacare and about whether Congress could force the states to implement the Affordable Care Act. Texas, for instance, has fought very vigorously against such things as being required to expand its Medicaid, which is paid for jointly by both the federal and the state governments. And the reason that they don't want to expand Medicaid in Texas is because they are afraid that the incentives that are being offered by the federal government will go away and the state will be left on the hook for funding a program that they really don't want to fund. And this is a fight that centers around federalism. And a lot of the issues that have gone before the Supreme Court lately have centered around federalism. So before we get to federalism, let's talk a little bit about our systems of government. There are three main systems of government that we need to be aware of. First is the unitary system of government, which is one central government that controls the weaker states. This is where we give all the power to the national government and very little, if any, power to the state governments. And an example would be China, the United Kingdom, but in the United Kingdom, Scotland has been granted its self-rule, but for the most part, the United Kingdom is a unitary system. And so you have a central government telling the states what to do, and it's a downward system. Now, in a confederation, the states tell the central government what to do, and the states have the majority of the power, so it goes in the other direction. The definition of a confederation is that an organization of states, a loose alignment, like a handshake, to follow a central government. The nations can choose to follow or not to follow the lead of the central government. For instance, the Commonwealth of Independent States, also known as the Soviet Union, was a confederation. Switzerland's Canton system, the Confederate States of America from 1861 to 1865, and even the EU today, the European Union, would all be confederations, really. Now, a federal system is where power is shared. And so this is a horizontal system. It goes both ways, really. Power is shared by a central government that does have more power than the other two. Well, it has more power than the Confederation. And it also shares power with the states. And self-rule at the state level is one of the main hallmarks of a federal system. Each of the states have their own legislatures, and they can make their own laws, and the federal government has its legislature and it makes laws. The United States, Australia, the Federal Republic of Germany are all examples of federal systems. So before we go forward, let's talk about some important definitions. The first definition that we need to look at is the definition of federalism. So federalism will be, for our purposes, defined as a system of government that divides sovereign power across at least two political units. Sovereign power is defined as the amount of authority and autonomy that we give to each unit of government. So we have, in the United States system, three levels of government: national, state, and local. The underlying concept of federalism is the sharing of power, and it's a magical feat to share power between states and a federal government. The state governments are not responsible for national defense or foreign policy, and the federal government, in theory, is not responsible for issues like whether or not we should allow or forbid smoking in bars or restaurants. That's a local issue. Technically, education, for instance, is a local issue, yet it has become a federal issue lately, and we'll see how that works. The underlying question then becomes, should governance in the United States be more centered on the national level or the state level? And the answer really should be, it should be at both levels, yet originally the idea was to put it at the state level. But over time, the national level has gained more power and the states have lost power, and we'll see that. So let's look at some arguments for federalism. The argument for federalism was that authority is divided into levels, the national level and the state level, with the local level being under the states. It protects liberty, it moderates government power by a sharing of power, it strengthens the union and makes us a true United States, and it promotes more responsive government because it is both top-down in some respects, but mainly bottom-up. It's supposed to be designed to be a bottom-up system. I think the two levels should meet in the middle at some point. The Constitution has several supporting concepts built into it. First is the preamble itself. The preamble itself starts with the idea of we the people. So that means that the national government should not be supreme to the people or the states. The founders intended to have a less state-centric government under the Constitution, but they didn't want to get rid of the authority of the states or of the people themselves. They didn't want it to be a unitary form of government which is top-down. It's supposed to meet in the middle. Now, we put in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution a clause called the Necessary and Proper Clause. And this gives Congress the authority to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution foregoing powers, which are the enumerated powers we're going to talk about in just a little bit. We also say in Article 6 that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that the judges of every state have to be bound to federal law and constitutional law. Now, that's Article 6 to the Constitution. The contrary argument would be that if a national law is made and the states don't agree, the states should be able to what is called nullify that law. So there's been a great call for nullification lately, and when a state decides that it doesn't want to follow the policy of the national government, that's called nullification. So as an example, I gave you the example of Obamacare, and particularly the decision of the state of Texas not to extend Medicaid. And that decision is a nullification decision because federal policy is that you're supposed to extend Medicaid. That was part of the Obamacare plan. And we've created what many have called a loophole or a donut hole in coverage in Texas because we didn't extend eligibility for Medicaid. Now, the powers of the nation and the states are in the 10th Amendment, which establishes what are called reserve powers. These are powers that are not delegated to the national government. And if the power is not specifically delegated to the national government, it's supposed to be reserved by the states. And this is the basis for protecting states' rights. However, we have seen national power rise and state power diminish, particularly since the 1930s and 40s. And beginning in the 1960s, especially, we saw the use of what's called coercive federalism, or the carrot and the stick, which we're going to talk about a little later in this lesson. The idea here is that even though the federal government wasn't given specific authority to do certain things, the fact that it is funding certain programs and that the states have taken that funding give the national government certain powers that maybe it didn't have under the Constitution. And this has become a big battle between the states and the national governments. The constitutional concepts supporting states' rights begin with the 10th Amendment, which says that the powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people themselves. So if we don't specifically say the federal government can do something, in theory, the federal government can't do it. However, we have that elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause, which is kind of a loophole. Now, the 11th Amendment limits the ability of citizens to sue a state or local government that operates in good faith, and it also basically is used to substantiate states' rights as well. The full faith and credit clause really is one that deals with the relationship between states. And this is Article 4 of the Constitution. It requires that each state's law be honored by other states. So, for example, a legal marriage in one state, say Massachusetts, is supposed to be recognized across state lines. But until recently, Texas, for instance, had a constitutional amendment in its constitution which forbid the recognition of same-sex marriages. So we did not recognize a marriage coming from another state, which in theory is a violation of Article 4 of the Constitution. But under the Clinton administration, a federal law called the DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, was held in place. And so from 1998 until just recently, just this last summer really, the DOMA would allow Texas not to recognize, or any other state that wanted not to recognize same-sex marriages. But, as we know, the recognition of same-sex marriage has now become the law of the land by way of the courts, and we'll look at that more, and that becomes a federalism issue. So the powers of the nation and the states at the national level are enumerated powers. These are specific powers that include measures for security, defense, stable commerce, and we have the Supremacy Clause that says basically the Constitution of the United States comes first, then federal law, then state constitutional law, then state law. And the national implied powers come under that necessary and proper or elastic clause, which says that the government can make a law that supports its enumerated powers. The one area of the enumerated powers that we're going to look at that tends to be used more than any other is commerce, because it's the vaguest part of the enumerated powers. It is the least specific. Enumerated powers include the power to levy and collect taxes, the power to borrow money, to regulate interstate commerce, that's commerce between states, to set up rules of naturalization and bankruptcy, which means citizenship and how you become a citizen, and whether or not you can declare bankruptcy, to coin and regulate the value of money, to provide punishment for counterfeiting of money, to establish post offices and postal roads, to promote copyright law, to establish a federal court system, to punish crimes at sea, to declare war, to maintain an army, to maintain a navy, to regulate the military and the militia, to allow the president to use the militia in the case of an emergency, which means to call up state militias, and which is called federalization. Government to govern the capital of the United States and all of the U.S. possessions, and most importantly here, to make all laws necessary to carry out the duties above, which is your necessary and proper or elastic clause. These are the enumerated powers. Implied powers are those that Congress can grant itself because even though they're not enumerated, they're necessary in order to be able to conduct business. So the elastic clause of the Constitution gives Congress power to pass unspecified laws through the necessary and proper clause. This is a loophole. And the implied powers have often been called controversial, very controversial, because you get into fights between the states and the federal government. Over time, Congress's powers have grown. They have tended to grow as more and more kinds of government activity have been accepted as being implied. For instance, the ability to create equal opportunity and employment laws, the civil rights and voting rights legislation that were passed in the 1960s, minimum wage laws, social welfare laws. And then the question becomes, is it a federal or a state responsibility to provide health care or to see to the welfare of the health of the citizens? And right now the federal courts are seeing it as the responsibility and the power of the national government. And so Obamacare is at the present time the law of the land, and it has not been overturned on federalism issues, even though it has been argued greatly in terms of the idea of federalism. This is from your book, and it's basically a Venn diagram that shows the overlay of how powers are either kept at the national level, the state level, or shared. And national defense, currency, post offices, foreign affairs, and interstate commerce are all national powers. The lending and borrowing of money, the power to tax, the power of law enforcement, the power to charter banks, and the power of maintaining transportation and providing for transportation and funding transportation, all are shared powers. Now, at the state level, the power to charter local governments or to create cities, the power to oversee education, public safety, voter registration, and voting is specifically a state power, and intrastate commerce, which is commerce inside the state. But for instance, voter registration and voting has more and more become the power of the federal government, especially with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments, particularly the 15th Amendment of the Constitution following the Civil War. This is another chart that shows national powers, state powers, and concurrent powers. So national powers: printing money, regulating interstate commerce, making treaties and conducting foreign policy, declaring war, providing for the Army and the Navy, establishing post offices, and the necessary and proper clause. To the states, the power to issue licenses, to regulate intrastate commerce, which is commerce inside a state, to conduct elections. But the federal government has taken its powers as implied in order to oversee the conducting of elections to make sure that they're fair and that the equal opportunity clauses of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment are fairly implemented by the states. To establish local governments, to ratify amendments to the Constitution. Ratifying an amendment comes from the state. The fact that most amendments come down from the House of Representatives and the Senate. However, the states have to ratify. To promote public health and safety. Again, Obamacare gets into this, and welfare programs get into this. This has become more and more national power. They may exert powers that the Constitution does not delegate to the national government, and it does not prohibit the states from using. But again, we have some overlay here between national and state powers that tend to be the source of a lot of argument. And then you have your concurrent powers, those powers that are shared. For instance, collecting taxes, building roads, borrowing money, establishing courts, making and enforcing laws, chartering banks and corporations, and spending money for general welfare. Because remember, the preamble of the Constitution says promote the general welfare. So also the Fifth Amendment allows the taking of private property for public purposes with just compensation. So that can be done both at the state and the national level. Now, powers denied the national government. The national government may not violate the Bill of Rights. It may not impose export taxes among the states. It may not use money from the Treasury unless the House of Representatives has approved it, and it may not change state boundaries. It can't enter into treaties with other countries, or those are state powers, excuse me. The states cannot enter into treaties with other countries, so the state of Texas cannot have a treaty with, say, Japan. But we can have an agreement then that comes under the State Department. We may not print our own money. We may not tax imports or exports of goods. We may not interfere with contracts. And we may not suspend someone's right to with rights under the Bill of Rights without due process. That's the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment and the 5th Amendment as well. Historically, 1789 to 1865, we pretty much shared power, and we divvied it up in a way that was very separate. There were national powers and there were state powers. The national view was, for instance, in McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819, that the Supremacy Clause gave the national government power. The states' rights view came under the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which, for instance, said that the states had the right to regulate property, and particularly slavery, and so a southern state that saw a slave taken into a northern state that was free could require that a slave be returned to them. So the Civil War would get into the issue of national authority from 1861 to 1865. So after 1865, a new era is going to take place. Important court cases that you need to understand. The first court case, the most important court case I think we study, is Marbury-Madison, which gives the federal courts the power of judicial review, which is the power of the court to overturn a law based on constitutionality. This is a step that gives the federal courts and it gives the national government more power. The second is upholding the right to create a Bank of the United States, McCulloch versus Maryland, which is all about the Supremacy Clause. And that gives the power to have implied powers, not just enumerated powers. Gibbons versus Ogden is going to broadly define Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce, which gives it probably the broadest ability to determine federal policy. And it really expands federal policy. The Gibbons versus Ogden argument of 1824. Then the Dred Scott decision, Dred Scott versus Sanford, which was a very controversial case. It intensifies the national debate over slavery. It rules that Congress does not have the right to ban slavery in U.S. territories. Of course, after the 13th Amendment, it becomes a moot question. Now, Brown versus Board of Education will overturn several other court decisions, and it will invalidate racial segregation in schools, and it will lead to the unraveling of what we call de jure or legal segregation in all areas of public life. And as we go into civil rights and civil liberties, you'll see how very important the Brown decision is. Roe v. Wade in 1973 says to the states, you must allow for abortion in the first trimester. And this becomes an issue of policy and morality, which gets to the distinction between your pro-life and your pro-choice advocates. And it's a big bone of contention between the national and the state governments today. So if we look at the evolution of federalism, you're going to see different forms come from over time. The first form is a dual federalism. We'll talk about it. The second form is cooperative federalism, or marble cake. The dual federalism is called layer cake. You'll see why in a moment. Then we have picket fence federalism starting in 1961. Fiscal federalism starting in 1937, at the same time cooperative did. New federalism starting in the late 1960s and going into the 1980s. And coercive federalism, which is from the 70s until now. And we're going to define and describe each of these here in just a moment. So phase 1, 1789 to 1937, is known as the era of dual federalism. Both the national and state governments are viewed as distinct. There's very little overlap in their activities or their services. This is sometimes called layer cake federalism because each layer of the government is separate and distinct, and there's very little, if any, overlap of authority or of responsibility. So the period is both state-centered and nation-centered. There are shared areas of responsibility, and then there are also distinct areas of responsibility that the state has and the federal government has. But in 1937, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is forced with the idea that he has got to somehow fix the problem of the Great Depression, and the use of what we call fiscal federalism or government spending will come to play, and that will change the view of federalism to something much different. Dual federalism is all about laissez-faire capitalism, leaving things alone. Dual federalism is the separation of national and state powers. The 14th Amendment is interpreted to give states a lot of discretion, And before 1937, not a lot of the Bill of Rights or a lot of the federal policies had been forced upon the states. But judicial protection of businesses, the Supreme Court was limited national power to regulate business and industry. It tried to hold down the exercise of the Commerce Clause. National authority would prevail as the Supreme Court would eventually approve Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal economic and social programs in 1937, and the government goes on a spending spree. So Roosevelt's New Deal was intended to create jobs during the Great Depression. Lyndon Johnson was a Roosevelt follower. He was a Roosevelt Democrat, and he wanted what he called his Great Society, which was an increased amount of spending on social services in the 1960s. And then by the time Reagan comes along in the 1980s and 90s, you get the Republican Revolution, which involves the rollback of federal authority, which is called devolution. And then 9/11 comes along under George Bush, and even though he's a Republican, you start to see a great amount of increased federal grants and spending, and we'll look at all of those. So let's talk about your dual or layer cake federalism. There's a distinct separation of powers as you go through. See, the federal level here, the state level is another flavor, the local level another flavor with filling in between. Courts limit interference with state and local governmental powers, and the local governmental powers are granted by the states. So things like education are at the local level. The state it has its own priorities, each state differently, and the federal government is there to provide national defense. And then by 1937, it starts to expand its powers down into the state and local levels. And that's when we start to see these things mix, which brings us to something called marble cake, and we'll look at that in a moment. Marble cake federalism is really something that we see 1937 to 1961, even though it exists today. It's cooperative. The elements of your state and national government are supposed to work together. It starts with FDR's alphabet soup of New Deal programs. The government steps in with grants and spending to kickstart the economy in the late 1930s and early 1940s. It continues today, but prior to the 1960s and the Civil Rights era, this was really the way it was done, was to try to help people in terms of economics and to help us get out of the Great Depression. And it really was able to provide safety nets like Social Security. Greater cooperation and collaboration between the levels of government and increases in national authority, but you had a slight reduction in state supremacy, but still the states had a lot more authority. But then in the 1960s, we started to see a reduction in state authority, as we'll see here in a moment. So we call it marble cake federalism because everything is mixed together, mixed all together. Increased power of federal government through the use of grants and aid. It's all about federal grants. Even though the federal government does not have specific authority, because it's providing the state and local governments with grants, it is able to intervene in their business and to establish some standards. State and local governments will share responsibility and power with the national governments, and the power of the state and local governments start to decrease slowly as federal funding increases. Contemporary federalism is really our discussion about how federalism works today. And we are in an era of interdependency and intergovernmental relations, which means that intergovernmental relations is talking about the relationship between the states and also between each state and the federal government. And the relationship between each state and the federal government really differs depending upon where you are and the values politically of the state that you live in. So there is an interdependency and a growth in intergovernmental relations. The two have to work together. So cooperative federalism was all about shared policy responsibilities. The national, the state, and the local levels all worked together. You had joint funding, administration, and determination of programs, but we're beyond that now. FDR would expand national governmental powers in the 1930s, and he did it by way of this little magic rabbit over here, government spending. His New Deal shifted more power than ever to the national government. Through major new programs to address the Great Depression, the federal government would expand its reach, spend more money to pay for these programs, and expand what we call the power of the purse. And that's really how the growth of the federal government has happened, is through the power of the purse. From 1961 until now, we've had the use of picket fence federalism. And picket fence federalism is a version of cooperative federalism that emphasizes that you have to have departments at the state level, the local level, and the federal level that work together, like a Department of Education at the state level, Department of Education, which would be, for instance, the Texas Education Agency. The school districts at the local level, which work with the Texas Education Agency, and then at the federal level, you have the Department of Education. Also, you have, as an example, your highways, the Department of Transportation at the national level, Texas Department of Transportation at the state level, and TxDOT and the city and your local contractors at the local regional level. So this version of federalism emphasizes policymakers working together in the same area within a given policy area. They have more in common with others in their areas at different levels of government than with people at the same level of government. So there's an emphasis on cooperation and funding between departments. So each state has a department that works with a comparable department at the national level, and the same at the local level, working with the state. So this is an example of picket fence federalism. The boards that hold the pickets together are your federal, state, and local levels. Each of the pickets in the fence are going to be your policy, like education, healthcare, public safety, housing and urban development, highways and roads, finance and taxation, drug policies, social services, environmental policies, commerce and industry. Shared responsibilities between the federal, state, and local governments, and it's highly focused on specific policy components. So all the policy components are tied together with rails going across at the different levels of government, yet each of the pickets in the fence, each of the boards in the fence, is really a policy level. This is picket fence federalism. When we talk about contemporary federalism, it's all about money. Fiscal federalism, using federal funds for state programs. Grants and aid is cash payments to the states and to the local governments. Categorical grants are federal funds that are restricted to certain state programs, like education or roads and construction. A block grant, on the other hand, gives the state a certain amount of money and for a general concern, and the state decides how to spend it. So states love block grants. They don't like categorical grants as much, but they're dependent upon them. So fiscal federalism really starts in 1937 and it continues today. Using grants from the national government to the lower level governments with varying degrees of control and holding each level accountable is fiscal federalism. Categorical grants give national government a lot of control, but block grants give government at the state and local level more control. So categorical grants are national control. Block grants, state and local control. Fiscal federalism involves the use of federal grants and spending to increase national government control. It has caused the balance between national and state powers to shift from the states to the national government since the late 1930s. And this term right here is often used to describe it: coercive. Why? Because the national government as it spends more and more on grants, can also require more and more from the states and take more power away from the states. So it does that through the use of mandates. For instance, DWI. The DWI mandate actually came down to the 50 states, as well as things like seatbelt laws, in exchange for continued highway funds. Now, if you did what the federal policy was and you changed your DWI limit and you required the seatbelt laws, then in exchange you got highway funds. If you did not, they threatened to take the highway funds away. We often call this carrot and stick federalism. The extension of federal authority into local education has been done through things like Title I grants and other forms of federal funding. And so that's how No Child Left Behind, AYP, and Common Core, and Race to the Top have all happened. For instance, if a state participated in Race to the Top, it had to adopt Common Core, and it had to meet certain AYP standards. If it didn't adopt Race to the Top, it was held more accountable and punitively harmed, threatened with having its funding taken away. And that's why schools are so intent on testing. New federalism is something that happened from 1969, and we still see it today. Sometimes it's known as this other term over here, devolution or Reagan federalism. It attempts to shift power to the states by consolidating different categorical grants into block grants, which give states more discretion, more authority over their programs, like welfare. And it became prevalent during the Reagan era of the 80s and into the 90s. It involved a shifting of responsibility and decision-making to the states. That shifting is known as devolution. It also shifts responsibility to raise the money for programs and initiatives that the states want rather than at the federal level. So yes, there's less federal intervention, but there's more requirement on the state to raise through taxes or whatever. If the state wants to do something, then the state has to raise the money. So there's a choice there. Devolution then is defined as the idea that American federalism can be strengthened by a shift of power from national governments to states. It is belief that was held more strongly by Republicans than Democrats. It dramatically increased during the Republican Revolution of 1994. The Supreme Court has advanced devolution, especially in the latter decades of the 20th century, and the devolution movement really stopped with George W. Bush, who had to raise money because he wanted to be the education president, so he had his No Child Left Behind, but also because of security issues after 9/11. From 1970s to the present, really a lot of Republicans especially tend to call this coercive federalism, and that involves federal preemptions of state and local authority and unfunded mandates, which means requiring things but not giving you the money to do it on state and local governments to force the states. So this is forcing the states to change policies to match national goals. It's often referred to as carrot and stick because the funding is based on the states meeting certain mandates and criteria. Those states that meet national policy mandates are rewarded. Those states that do not have funding taken away. The example being highway funds and DWI and seatbelt laws. So we call this carrot and stick. The carrot is the financial enticement and grants to the states to do what the federal government wants them to do. The stick is with threatening to or actually withdrawing financial support from states that don't want to comply with federal requirements. So education is a perfect example. The whole idea of testing is that, and AYP is that if the states and at the local level, if the schools don't meet adequate yearly progress, they're threatened with either being closed or having their funding taken away. So why have national powers increased? There are three characteristics of American politics that have led to the reinforcement of a strong national government. Number one, we turn to the national government during a crisis or a war. Post 9/11, all of a sudden you started to see a rise in national power. The civil rights and economic rights struggles of the Great Society in the 1960s led to more government spending, welfare programs, and expansion of federal grants. Coercive federalism, also known as federal regulations and mandates, requiring states to change policy. But today, we have a globalized society. Is local or state government even relevant, or should everything be at the national government? If we do that, then what we've done is we've turned to a system that is more unitary, more like Great Britain. Do we really want that? That's not what the Founding Fathers wanted. They wanted a shared level of power. But let's look at something. When we come to federal, state, and local shares of government and tax revenue, the local governments get 18%, the states 30%, and the federal 52%. And the federal government, through taxes, is giving a lot more to these guys. So dependence on federal funding has grown. And that's shown in this chart. Look, from 1955 and then into the mid-70s, then we go to the Reagan years, and you can see where it plateaus. And then all of a sudden, we go into a growth in federal grants and spending. So from 1940 to the mid-70s, federal grants exponentially rose, particularly in the 1960s and 70s. In the Reagan era, from 1980 to 89, it saw a trend towards less federal spending, as you can see. Since 1996, federal grant spending has again increased exponentially, particularly after September 11th, because of two areas, education and defense and security. Now, this is looking at the states that have taken federal grants as a percentage. Those in yellow, like Oregon, Montana, New Mexico, Wyoming, South Dakota, North Dakota, Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia, and it looks like Vermont, are all very highly dependent. 25% or more of their funding comes from federal grants. Texas is in this green area, which is 20 to 24 for 25%. And then in purple, it's 20% or less. These are states that have said no thank you. So, the reaction of the states. The states are fighting back. States have fought back for progressive and conservative causes. Competitive federalism is a result, which is competition among the states to provide the best policies to attract businesses. Texas is very big at this. Competitive federalism can be a good thing as it allows people to vote with their feet, but the critics have also said that it can lead to what's called a race to the bottom, where states compete in unhealthy ways and attempt to put their money behind economic causes rather than social causes. Lastly, let's look at No Child Left Behind as an example of federalism today. With No Child Left Behind, the George Bush administration increased the national government's power over education, which in theory is at the local level, at the most local level, the school districts. States are required now, under No Child Left Behind, to test students and to meet goals determined by the federal government in order for them to receive their federal funding. And federal funding is anywhere from 20 to 40%, depending upon the school and the level of the economic level of the students in that school. Federal funding is 20 to 40% of a school's revenue. But it also included a lot of unfunded mandates. So we get this cartoon here. Look, class, I'm not crazy about this either. No Child Left Behind mandates. And they say, but what really frosts me is the way that we have to pay for the hoops. So they're talking about an unfunded mandate, right? Many federal grants and programs now require state governments to supplement or pay for requirements that are not funded by the federal government, which are unfunded mandates. Failure to comply with an unfunded mandate may result in a loss of federal funding. So has Nickleby worked? If you look down here, these are going from 1970 to just recently, about 2012. These are test scores, and these are student performance levels, and they're all flat. Yet, look what's happened to educational spending. It's just gone up and up and up and up and up and up and up. And so, has putting money into education really worked? Increased call for Common Core instruction has demonstrated little or no benefit. Increased stress on students to pass high-stakes tests has not been very positive. A call, then, from parents and school districts and states to reduce the amount of testing and an increased spending has not resulted in additional educational attainment. So a lot of people would argue, and this is the last of our slides, a lot of people would argue that Nickleby has not worked.